I'm here with Chad Bown, Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute and co-host of Trade Talks, a weekly podcast about trade policy. Thanks for joining me, Chad.
Thanks for having me.
So here's President Trump at the State of the Union talking about trade policy.
America has also finally turned the page on decades of unfair trade deals that sacrificed our prosperity and shipped away our companies, our jobs, and our wealth.
Chad, after year one of his administration, where would you say President Trump is on trade policy?
So there was a lot of rhetoric during the campaign, and expectations were that President Trump was really going to shake things up in terms of an American-first approach to trade policy. On his third day in office, he did withdraw the United States from the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, the TPP. Now, that deal has continued to move forward even without the United States. So the 11 other countries that are part of that deal, Japan, Canada, Australia, Mexico, they're pushing forward. And any time other countries sign trade deals that America is not a part of, that hurts American exporters. They can't compete in foreign markets if they face tariffs that other countries don't. So that's a concern. At the same time, President Trump has opened up the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, for renegotiations. They just completed the 6th round in Montreal, but they're still really far apart on some of the really contentious proposals that the Trump administration has introduced on rules of origin for automobiles. They want to change those up. President Trump's administration also wants to strip out a lot of the legal enforcement protections and dispute settlement provisions in that agreement that protect exporters that Canada especially is really worried about keeping. So they're not very close to renegotiating that deal yet either.
So let's talk more about that. Aside from the negotiations, the Trump administration also has had a lot of policy investigations that have been taking place under various laws. Can you update us there?
So recently, President Trump imposed tariffs on imports of solar panels and washing machines. These are important because these are cases that came forth under a relatively little used law called a safeguard law. And it could be the signal of lots of these sorts of cases still to come. If he has signaled a willingness to impose import protection, we might see a lot of other industries coming in asking for trade barriers that would lead to higher prices for consumers and a lot of different types of products. In addition to that, we've seen the kind of standard cases that have been brought forward under typical laws, anti-dumping, countervailing duties, the unfair trade, the anti-foreign subsidy laws. We have those under all administrations, so those aren't new. What's a little bit new in this administration is President Trump has decided to self-initiate some cases there. So his administration is actually bringing forward its own cases. And there have been some cases against Canada in particular that have been high profile. So on lumber, new potential tariffs on newsprint and pipe that could affect billions of dollars of Canadian exports, and those could actually tie back into the NAFTA talks and make those more complicated as well.
So what about China? Has anything been imposed there?
Well, China is the most interesting and probably the biggest one to watch. So we're still awaiting the result of the investigations under the national security law. So the Trump administration began looking into the question of whether imports of steel and aluminum are a threat to U.S. national security, and there's a potential that they might impose import restrictions there. The concern there really has to do with China and the potential for overcapacity of Chinese production in those industries. But the problem is any trade barriers that might get imposed are really unlikely to just target China. The United States already has tremendous import restrictions through other laws on Chinese steel and aluminum. So if we impose new tariffs, it's likely to affect Europe, Japan, South Korea, Mexico, and Canada even, our key allies. But the big ongoing investigation still that we're waiting on is this Chinese unfair trade case, the one about Chinese intellectual property, and whether they're forcing American companies, other Western companies to locate production in China, to do joint ventures with local Chinese companies, to transfer their technology to local Chinese companies. Whether that is going to result in potentially new tariffs by the American administration or other sorts of restrictions on investment, that's the one that we're waiting for closely as well.
So there's a lot to look forward to in the coming weeks. Thanks for joining us, Chad.
Thanks for having me.